Good afternoon in Israel and Palestine, where most of us speakers are. We are now more than 22 months after the Hamas massacre on October 7th, 2023, and the abduction of 251 people to Gaza, 50 of whom are still held captive, and about 20 believed to be alive. October 7th was one of the most violent days in the history of the conflict, broadcast live by its perpetrators. And it ushered in the most violent 2 years of this conflict between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs over this piece of land that both communities claim as their own home. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum, but needs to be contextualized in the 140-year conflict that preceded it. Still, given the magnitude of the massacre and the heinous forms of violence committed by its perpetrators, many expected and even understood that the Israeli response would be harsh and disproportional. In the first months after October 7th, many accepted Israel's assault on Gaza as a legitimate act of self-defense. But the logic of self-defense, even among those who perceived it as such, has long lost its coherence. Conservative estimates about the death toll in Gaza currently stand at least 62,000 people, and likely many more. More than half of them are women and children. Tens of thousands more are wounded with almost no access to healthcare. Hunger is now widespread. About 70%, 75% of houses in the Gaza Strip are destroyed or severely damaged. Full cities have been systematically razed to the ground by the IDF. It is easy to point at Netanyahu and his far-right government as the main culprits responsible for Israel's actions in Gaza. After all, they are the ones who are dictating and driving Israel's policies in Gaza and elsewhere. It is also well known that for the past 22 months, Netanyahu has had multiple opportunities to reach a ceasefire, release the hostages, and end the war and destruction in Gaza. But for the sake of his political survival, he chose a different route. But pointing the finger solely at Netanyahu and his government obscures the fact that the majority of Israelis are either indifferent to the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza or in support of it. Dehumanization of Palestinians is widespread among large swaths of Israeli society. It existed prior to October 7th, but it was dramatically accelerated after. It seems that only recently cracks in this wall of indifference and dehumanization have emerged, as seen in public demonstrations now in Israel. While global attention is on Gaza, we also need to note that there is a dramatic increase of violence and dispossession towards Palestinians in the West Bank, perpetrated by Jewish settlers who operate with impunity, often supported by the army and the government. Returning to Gaza, labeling Israel's actions in Gaza as genocide is contentious for many, and for me personally, excruciatingly difficult on an emotional level. After all, Israel was founded on the heels of the greatest and most systematic genocide of the 20th century. The never again should be a universal one, and certainly upheld by the Jewish state, given its history. It is also difficult for me because some of Israel's critics have accused it of committing genocide since its foundation in 1948. Even as early as October 8th, while the massacre was still unfolding and thousands of rockets were being fired indiscriminately into urban centers in Israel, there were quite a few of Israel's critics who already then accused it of committing genocide in Gaza. And then there is the question of how to factor in the actions, interests, and motive of Hamas as a crucial player in the dynamics of violence taking place in Gaza. But as Israel's assault on Gaza continues to unfold and the level of destruction and devastation has become impossible to fathom, it has become increasingly challenging to explain Israel's actions without asking about the intent and the end goal of this indefensible level of violence. The framing of Israel's actions as genocide has now become widespread. Most recently, two prominent Israeli human rights organizations issued their reports labeling Israel's actions as genocide. And they are the reasons for this panel. We convened this panel in order to discuss these reports and also to discuss internal dynamics in Israel about the war and the way Israelis and Palestinians inside Israel have been addressing the level of violence perpetrated by the IDF in Gaza. With us today are Sarit Michaeli, the International Outreach Director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territory, Tirza Leibovich, Deputy Director and Director of Programs, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, Hassan Jabarin, Founder and General Director of Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, Asaf David, the Director of the Israel in the Middle East Cluster, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and Ernesto Verdeja, Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Global Politics here at the Kroc Institute. Each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes for their presentation, and then if the panelists would like to respond to each other, we will give them this opportunity after this first round, and we will then move to questions and answers. If you would like to submit your questions to the panelists, please do so in the chat function. Sarit, the floor is yours, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you very much, Asher, and thank you for having me. I just have to say that the last time we spoke together on a panel in this context, we were talking about a ceasefire. And of course, this did not materialize. I shudder to think of what could have been saved, the number of lives, the number of homes, the number of futures that could have been saved had there been pressure from the international community and primarily from the United States at the time to force Israel to stop its assault on Gaza. So it's just a very somber and devastating thought of just how much damage could have been averted. I'd like to speak very briefly about the main findings of B'Tselem's report and also what it means to us in terms of our call as an Israel-based organization, part of Israeli civil society that also includes Palestinians as well as Israeli staff members. I think if I really boil it down to kind of the main gist of it, we would say that Israel's policy in the Gaza Strip, the horrific outcomes, the statements by Israeli policymakers about the goals of the attack, they all lead to the unequivocal conclusion that Israel is taking coordinated, deliberate action to destroy Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip. In other words, Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This is the textbook definition. Now, the understanding that the Israeli regime is committing genocide, along with the deep concern that it may expand to other areas, and I'll speak about this very, very shortly in a moment, demands urgent and clear action from both the Israeli public and the international community. And this is what B'Tselem has called for at the end of our report. We think that all possible means that are available under international law must be used to stop the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, it is hard to grasp that for the last 2 years, we are, us Israelis, I don't include everyone here in the we, but certainly our government, our army has been committing this horrific crime. But B'Tselem reached the conclusion that what we see is genocide, and then it was immediately clear to us that it's our obligation to speak out about it, that we cannot be silent, and that we have an obligation to do everything we can in order to stop this. And this means, from our perspective, calling on everyone around us and calling on the world to take all feasible action on, that's legal to stop this. Now, in the report, what we are trying to say is not to make a legal pronouncement. Maybe Tirza can talk about the PHR report's legal pronouncements. That's not our goal in our report. However, and you know, the report doesn't really enter the question of whether Israel will at some point be found guilty in the ICJs of committing genocide. Although I have to say, from a lay person's perspective. I'm not a lawyer, certainly not. I don't have any relevant legal experience on this issue. But the further we progress in this carnage, in these horrors, and the more is coming out, emerges about the Israeli policies that have led to this carnage, the more likely it seems, and the more people understand that this is a real prospect, which is absolutely shocking. But what we are saying is that when you look at genocide as a phenomenon, an historic, sociological, political phenomenon, then this is what we are doing. When we say we, when I say we, I mean Israel, the collective that I'm part of, the Israeli regime. But from the report is actually called Our Genocide because we're writing from the perspective both of Israelis and Palestinians who are living here. The Israelis write from the perspective of people who belong to the group, to the collective of the perpetrators. The Palestinians have authored the report, participated in the authoring from the perspective of people who are victims. And some of our colleagues and us, staff members in Gaza, have actually been victims of Israel's genocide and lost dozens of family members and their homes and, you know, their lives, many of their futures, as part of this. And this is, I think, the first time that people who are actually involved in this genocide write a report about it. I think that's what we're trying to contribute here. One of the questions we've been asked again and again over the last few weeks since the issuing is like, why now, right? And why have you waited so long? And it is absolutely true that Palestinian organizations, I'm not talking about the people who are discussing this on the 8th of October, people have been discussing this for years, for months and over a year. The Palestinian human rights organizations, the UN Special Rapporteur, Amnesty, etc., etc. So B'Tselem is far from the first, but I do think we're the first, or that we break new ground in a few things, and I'd like to just say them very briefly. I think the first is a description of the root causes of this genocide, like what made it not as a kind of historical imperative, but what enabled Israel's genocide, our genocide. And we analyze the long history of Jewish supremacy, of dehumanization, of lack of accountability, of all of these factors that have enabled it. And then we also look at the trigger. And again, from our perspective, the historical perspective, genocides often in history were triggered by a certain event that then the perpetrating group felt was an existential risk. And we also we analyze October the 7th and Hamas's attack against Israeli civilians as a trigger. We also take that opportunity to express our deep condemnation, both of the attack, of the crimes committed within this attack, and also of the crimes committed since. For example, the holding of the Israeli hostages, which still goes on. But primarily our focus is on October the 7th as an event that led to Israel changing policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians from a policy of domination and control to a policy of annihilation. And this is, we show how incitement to genocide exists in Israeli society and is not challenged. And we show how the government that we have, that is the most far-right fanatical government in Israel's history, cynically manipulated and weaponized October the 7th in order to pursue policies like the destruction and forcible transfer and ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, and certainly the takeover of Gaza in order to reoccupy it and resettle it. And these policies, they have been pursued by the Israeli right and by this government long before October the 7th. So these are additional issues that B'Tselem discusses in our report that we would say add more to the conversation. And then one final thing, which I think we also contribute to, is our warning that under these conditions that have enabled Israel's genocide in Gaza, and have not changed in terms of the political situation, the lack of any kind of international action that has actually or could actually lead to its end. Under these circumstances, we warn that the risk of genocide could expand to other areas where Palestinians live under Israeli control with no protection whatsoever. Primarily, I would say the West Bank is an example, and we already see incitement, deeply, broadly expressed incitement for genocide of Palestinians throughout the West Bank. And again, this is something that has to warrant international action. We haven't seen any of this action yet, but our perspective is that world leaders who are not taking action have a responsibility themselves. The report uses even the terminology of complicity, and I think it's quite interesting because today Human Rights Watch have also issued a report demonstrating that the United States is also complicit in Israeli crimes. So I think I finish here, and again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and very happy to kind of discuss it further later on.
Thank you very much, Sarit, for your comments. We'll move straight to Tirza's presentation. Tirza, please, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. The Gaza Strip is not new to physicians for human rights in Israel. For the last 20 years, the organization has put out over 100 delegations of doctors, Palestinian and Jewish Israelis, who've been to the Gaza Strip, a network of connections. Professionals in Gaza are the colleagues of the members of our organization. And likewise, the situations of attacks from where PHRI made analysis from the perspective of health, that is not new either. It has not started in October 2023. The actual attacks on hospitals as a phenomenon hasn't happened often. There are several noteworthy occurrences of attacks on hospitals, but mainly what we have seen is a constant drying up of the health system alongside many other systems in the Gaza Strip for years through the constant and consistent blockade, systemic blocking of movement of people, of provisions, and of course that had a devastating effect on the health system in Gaza. So that's in the background. Now, when the Hamas attacks on October 7th happened, I think everyone, in addition to the dread of what happened on October 7th, there was immediately the dread of what will happen on October 8th onward. And so PHRI kicked into action and did what we usually do, which is document the attacks either on the health system or that have to do with the health system. And that's how our work began 22 months ago. Now, it's one thing to document attack after attack, which is what we did initially. So, Asher, just to note, you were saying that some people on October 8th already came out with a determination that genocide is happening. I'm not saying that, but I will say that early in October 2023, 22 evacuation orders for 22 hospitals came out in the north of Gaza, out of the Strip's 36 hospitals. So, we do see a systemic approach early on. But for us at PHRI, at the outset, what we were doing was doing a kind of a linear documentation. And the very unfortunate events, the attacks by Israel, gave us a lot of work in that respect. At some point, as we were documenting the events, there was so to speak, a click, because we were looking at something on a different scale. In addition to the massive attacks on hospital after hospital, we started tracking the effects on the population. So when you attack a hospital, you're not attacking only the physicians the medical teams and the wounded and the sick who are there, and you're not attacking even only the people who are taking shelter, which in many cases, thousands of civilians were taking shelter in hospitals. They were places that were seen as relatively safe. Everything is relative because of the special status that hospitals carry in international law. The effect that it had on everyone in the region. So if you take away hospitals, you take away the place where people can go to get any kind of treatment. And indeed, what we started tracking was the attacks on hospitals, the move after attacks of hospitals. These were accompanied by evacuation orders, and then you had populations having to displace elsewhere, which floods the health system in that area. So we started understanding what we need to track goes beyond that linear perspective. Other aspects that we were tracking that don't have to do just with the infrastructure. So this appears in the report that came out. We're talking about eventually, until up to today, over 1,600 doctors and members of medical teams, paramedics, nurses. So 1,600 and more who have been killed. Just to take the example of Shifa Hospital, 6 department directors who've been killed, and prominent hospital directors as well. In addition to that, in a separate track, we were tracking the detention of healthcare workers. And, we have a whole body of work in Physicians for Human Rights Israel that looks at what happens in prisons, in detention camps, and we saw the systemic detention, mass detention of close to 400 doctors and medical team workers. Until today, there are still about 100 who are in detention, and important to mention that none of these have been formally charged. So we're starting to see here the taking away, the clipping of the wings of a system. In addition to that, and this is also, I asked you to address some of the, you put some questions about possible military justifications, defense considerations, etc. We were seeing the blocking of evacuation of the sick and the wounded. So it's not even, I can address later the allegations that in some cases, in fact, by Israel, by the claims it made in most cases, there was the use by Hamas operative of hospitals in a way that removed the protection that hospitals have. We can talk about that later. Eventually the evidence is scant, even by going by Israel's version of events and what it has presented. But I do want to note that if we move our eyes and look at what Israel was, in addition, doing in terms of the sick and the wounded and blocking their evacuation either to the West Bank, which was the most natural place for them to receive treatment once hospitals have become inoperable, as well as to third countries. And we had to go to court unsuccessfully in order to try to create those channels of evacuation. But these accumulations of kinds of attacks led us to the second point that I want to make, which is when we were then decided to interrogate whether what we're seeing here is beyond the accumulation of war crimes, but something that is amounting to genocide, looking at the Genocide Convention, and we were going by, as Sarit said, we were interested in looking at whether the legal standard of genocide is met, and I can address that as well later, why. While most of us, certainly lay people, probably think of genocide as an issue of quantity. In other words, many people killed or many people harmed, which was the case with regard to the Gaza Strip, horrifyingly so. We were looking at actually another article, another section in the Genocide Convention, which from our perspective, in addition to the definition of genocide as the certain kind of intention combined with the killing or the harm, we were looking at the article that we felt better mirrored what was happening on the ground. And that is the article that talks about inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to destroy the group in whole or in part. So inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to destroy. That is what we began understanding, that is what we're seeing here. Because when we widened our perspective beyond the very medical lens, which I described now, and looking into social determinants of health as well, the destruction of arable land, even the fact that there was no education system to talk about. These are all determinants of health. Obviously, the obstruction of humanitarian aid. So the accumulation of all of these, from our perspective, and I think we made a very, I mean, the case is a very strong one, answers that definition of genocide. So in effect, what we're seeing was an attack on the survivability of a people, and that is the lens that we opened and we documented. I want to say a word about the issue of intention. Again, Asher, you kind of planted the seeds in your first words. Different organizations or organs took different routes in this. For example, in South Africa, before the International Court of Justice, a large part, not its only ground, but it has both that organs of the state have made. And in fact, what we have to discern here is an intention to destroy, which is talking about intention in general is tricky. Of a person, about myself, talking about my own intention is something tricky. You know, my what I think is my intention can trick me, and it's embedded it's materialized in the world, and all the more so when you're talking about the intention of a state, which is what has to be proven here. And so, what we did not go by we mentioned the statements from the prime minister through the president, through actually some judges in court as well, through army generals. But the focus for us was something else, which also we were relying here on jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in the previous case where genocide was determined to have happened, which is in the case of Serbia versus Croatia. And the criteria or the test for intention, well, first of all, the indicators there would be we discerned intention from the patterns of conduct. And we focused on how results and actions, actions embedded in reality and results. That was our focus. And what I explained here in terms of the extent of the harm, the multiple ways, the patterns here led us to conclude that the intention to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza is the only reasonable inference. Now, once we're in the realm of genocide, then...
Tisa, if you can conclude, because you have... Yes.
I guess my last point would be around why is this important? Why is this analysis, which, as Philippe mentioned, was not the first one made. Many have made it before. So I would say that coming out as organizations based in Israel, though it shouldn't be the case that it gives legitimacy to others to make that conclusion publicly. In fact, that's what it also did among others. And I will end by saying that while we, in other words, we the people, in other words, the people in Israel and the people of the world and governments have failed to prevent the genocide from occurring, understanding that this is what is occurring is actually important and helpful in assessing what is happening now in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of the attacks happening now. That framework should steer and is steering how we're thinking about addressing what is happening on the ground now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tirza. Hassan, floor is yours.
Yeah.
Minutes.
Yeah, good morning from New York. Good afternoon to Israel, Palestine, or Palestine, Israel. I was asked not to speak about the genocide in Gaza, but to speak about the effect of the war and the genocide on the Palestinian citizen of Israel. And in fact, it's much harder, this much harder question than to speak about the genocide in Gaza. Genocide in Gaza, you can describe the facts, and the facts speak about themselves. And this is what the good thing about the report of Batsalim and the BCHR, that you put the fact, lay the fact with courage, without hiding, and the facts speak about themselves, and the fact can speak about the intention. But when we speak about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, first question that we have to face, it's psychological question: how to live in a country that genociding your people, how to be professor in university when your students just came from Gaza and part of genociding your people, how to work in restaurant when your colleague in the restaurants, the workers, their son or themselves, they just came from Gaza or Lebanon or supporting the genocide from Palestinian. How to sit in your salon when you are bilingual person, Hebrew is your language and Arabic your language, and Hebrew is your culture and Arabic is your culture, and to open the TV and to listen to the news and to hear ministers of Israel say we have to kill and destroy the Palestinian people when you know that you are Palestinian. Are we speaking about situation of, or let me put it otherwise, what I am saying to my friends, I will tell you what. I am saying to my friends that I feel like a Jewish person who lived in Berlin in 1938, thinking, living in a state that killing his people, destroying his people, but his situation didn't come yet. His destruction didn't come yet. He has a little hope that it won't reach him, but he is not sure. This is the political mind of the Palestinian citizen of Israel. This affects their political behavior. In every war, our political behavior is to behave as second-class citizen. Second-class citizen behavior means that you have to work in order to be first-class citizen, to be equal. So your starting point that I am discriminated, but I am struggling to promote my situation. This is why in all the wars we struggle, we went to demonstrations, we try to make the situation better and to defend our rights. This time, this starting point was shifted, that we are not the class citizen, but we are aliens. The aliens, their struggle is different than struggle of people that they perceive themselves second-class citizens. The aliens, they are not, they believe that they cannot change the situation to better. The aliens know that they cannot affect positively and to affect and influence the public of the other side, in this case, the Jewish public. The aliens, they struggle, they resist, of course, for keeping the status quo. And this is where the Palestinian people create the term sumud. Sumud meaning to remain. Keep what you have. Keep your life. Keep your existence. So this is what I can say, that the struggle of the Palestinian citizen of Israel, it's a struggle for sumud, because they perceive that their life under risk, their life in Israel under serious dangers. This is why we define that our struggle now, struggle for sumud. Sumud is different than second-class citizen struggle. You struggle to keep what you already achieved, not to change, to keep the status quo. And this came because already from the beginning of the war, we knew that the legal system with the police, with the Attorney General, with the Supreme Court of Israel, treat the Palestinian citizen political rights different than the Jewish Israeli citizen. We tried to have demonstrations in the beginning. We tried to have demonstrations, or what we called it assemblies, that doesn't need license from the police. In both situations, the police deny the rights. When we asked to have license for peaceful demonstrations in Nazareth, in Al-Fahim, in Sahnin, in Harabi, the police didn't give license. When we said, okay, we don't need license, there are opportunity to have just assembly, people standing with their placards and not moving from place to place, like they are not marching, they are not demonstrating, and you don't need license. Even in that case, the police destroy the ability and arrested the people before they arrived to the place of the assemblies. When we went to the Israeli Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court dismissed those petitions. And for the first time in 30 years, the Israeli Supreme Court dismissed petitions for right of demonstration or right for assembly. And the Attorney General of the state supporting the police. And what was the argument of the police? That we don't want to take risk with the Arabs in this war, and we don't have enough manpower for that. The irony is, when the same Arab political party or Arab Jewish political party like Hadash asked to demonstrate in Al-Fahim, they were denied. But when they asked to demonstrate in Tel Aviv, they were permitted, meaning the apartheid was based on localities, based on the identity of the people that they are going to demonstrate. Not only the police take actions to oppress our rights, also the Israeli civil society. The biggest factor in Israeli civil society is the universities. For the first time, the Israeli universities indicted Arab students for supporting terror. Why? Because they sympathize with the people of Gaza in the beginning of the war. Even when there was no jurisdiction for the university to indict before disciplinary tribunal of them, the students, because the students wrote what they wrote while the university were closed. And even when this speeches has nothing to do with the campus and education and any university action, the university took the authority, charged the people, and we had 160 cases against the Palestinian students. When you ask the university why you don't indict also Jewish students, they will tell you we don't indict Jewish students because we decided that just to indict for supporting terror. Why you don't indict them for supporting genocide? Genocide is a crime. No, this is not what we decided. We decided only support terror. Why not against racism? The same answer, meaning we decided to indict only Arab students. So now in this case, when the Arab are aware that this is what they are facing, they realize that they are treated as fifth column, they are treated as enemy. And in fact, this what was the first statement of Netanyahu after the 7th of October. In his statement in the 8th of October, he said Israel is going to face 4 fronts. The front of Gaza, the front of the West Bank, the front of the North, meaning Hezbollah, Iran, and the internal fronts. The internal fronts meaning the Palestinian citizen of Israel. This is why the police was in power for the first time to arm Jewish citizens. To arm them against whom? Against the Palestinian citizen. To arm you, the Jewish person who live in Haifa, against your neighbors in Haifa. To arm you from Lod against your neighbor in Lod. And here I finish the last two sentences. And this, in fact, was the most dangerous act because it tells every Jewish citizen you can open fire against Arab citizen, and we can understand that you feel that you were under risk. This is the meaning of arming. Thank you. I finish here. The arm was arming.
Thank you very much, Hassan. We'll move to Asaf. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'll tell you a little bit about the work that we do at the Institute, the Van Leer Institute, and at the Forum for Regional Thinking for amplifying civilian voices from Gaza analysis, Palestinian and Arab analysis of the war and of the genocide. And the change over time that started from the beginning of the atrocities of October 7th to this date. So part of the projects that we do, or a main part of the projects that we do, is on before the war was amplifying Arab and Palestinian voices, narratives, analysis of political and other developments in the Middle East and in Israel-Palestine for the consumption of the Israeli public or the Israeli mainstream, because we know for years that the Israeli mainstream media does not cover those issues in a serious manner. I.e., it's a very, methodologically or nationally driven towards the Zionist narrative. And we wanted the Israeli public to, and not just the public, by the way, also the Israeli professional circles and even academic circles to be exposed to other narratives. Now, what happened after the 7th of October was it was a total collapse and breakdown of all the work that we tried to do, because the Israeli public was simply not able to read anything about Palestinian narratives, let alone Palestinians from Gaza after the 7th of October, and regretfully to this day. And I say it as a fact because it is a fact that wasn't just relevant to the work that we do independently on on our independent website or independent websites of let's say left or radical left outlets in Israel, but not. I mean, Haaretz, for example, or Ynet, which is a more mainstream media outlet in Israel, were not willing to publish any more translated or reviewed texts from Arabic on Palestinian issues, on the war, on the 7th of October, on Iran, on Hezbollah. Remember, it was the first weeks and months of the war. Hezbollah was part of it. Iran was part of it. Any narratives about not even critical narratives, Palestinian narratives from Gaza, from the West Bank, or even from the world on what was going on. And that is even though we chose very carefully those analysis and information, pieces of analysis and information that were critical of the 7th of October and were critical of Hezbollah and critical of Iran and so on and so forth. But obviously, we're also critical of Israel because this is, these are Arab and Palestinian perspectives. The Israeli public opinion and Israeli media, and to some extent even Israeli professional circles, were unable to compute or digest this kind of information. And I repeat, it was a critical analysis of what was going on in the war because I think during these months, the initial months after the breakout of the 7th of October atrocities, the Israeli public were simply unable to even hear something about Gaza or about the Palestinians, just because of the fact that it was aired, transmitted, written by Arab or Palestinian voices. And this was very, very tough for a project like ours, which again is committed to conveying these voices to the Israeli public. We decided in the beginning that we only focus on our Facebook page, that we could control each and every word very carefully of what we were saying. We couldn't publish whole text because the whole text would include usually criticism on Israel too. So we just highlighted those criticism, sorry. We just highlighted those texts that were critical of Hamas, critical of the adventure as they looked at it, the adventure of Hamas in the opening the war, and of course the responsibility of Iran and Iranian proxies and allies like Hezbollah that were seen and portrayed by those critics as interfering with Arab national interests and even obviously Palestinian national interests, and leading to the to disaster and destruction of Gaza and of Lebanon and other nation states in the Middle East. I think that the more the war developed and it was clearly that Israel is doing something between massive war crimes to crimes against humanity to genocide, and that it could not be denied anymore, not even in Israel. The way or the maneuvering space and public discussion and discourse was freeing up a little by little to include or to be able even to read and digest Palestinian voices, Arab voices, not just those who were critical of Hamas, but also very critical of Israel, and especially those civilians from Gaza with testimonies on what's happening to them on the ground. So part of this work was done through our official channels on the website, on Facebook, on independent websites in Israel like Local Call, the Seventh Eye, and other left to radical left media outlets. But also, little by little, in Haaretz, for example, they were willing to accept texts from Gaza describing the horror of people from Gaza. And also, personally, on some of us, on the personal pages on social networks of some of us, including myself, what was very interesting for me was to learn that sometimes when I see a very viral post from Gaza, for example, of a person whose two little children were killed at the beginning of the war, and he found a photo of him with one of his little kids and posted it and just wrote the story. This is my child, Mira. Last time I saw her was in November 2023. She was killed and buried under the ruins in our house. I still can't find my daughter Tala, for example. Something is very direct and blunt and dry like that. I remember seeing it, obviously crying, translating it to Hebrew, posting it on my own personal Facebook page. And I mean, apart from all the reactions I got and people who were horrified and shocked to see this testimony, which was one of many testimonies daily from Gaza, this person contacted me personally and say thank you for conveying our voices. And those people, and he was the first. After him came many who, after posting their stories, translating them to Hebrew or just reviewing them in Hebrew, they would contact us. And first they say thank you, and then keep posting and communicating with us directly, telling what's happening to them, telling the stories, sometimes even willing to convey their stories and write specifically to the Israeli public. One of those texts was written specifically to a conference in winter 2024. It was a testimony from Gaza of a friend who was back then still in Gaza, but then managed to flee with his family to Ismailia. And he wrote a letter to the attendees of the conference of the Faithful Left in Israel. And I read this letter both in Arabic and with the translation to Hebrew, and people were crying. So, and it was just the beginning. I mean, since then, I was very moved to see how people from Gaza react to the fact that the stories are echoed and told in Israel and gain more and more traction and more amplification in Israeli public discourse. And
Yeah. Thank you.
you
Asaf, if you
want me
can
to stop here,
conclude.
Asher, or just
If
I
you can
conclude?
conclude, yes.
Okay, so just a conclusion with a small remark. As academics and intellectuals, we're used to talk about root causes and what happened before, and we know that the root cause of the problem here is the dangerous combination of religion and nationalism in Israel from the very beginning, from the outset. The idea of Jewish and democratic, can it be really democratic if it's Jewish, and so on and so forth. And once the sovereign is God and not the citizen, then you end up with apartheid, with something that is much less than a democracy, and not to mention liberal democracy, and with Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. And now we can see it as the epitomization of this as ethnic cleansing and genocide. So that aside, we cannot talk to the Israeli public on these terms right now. The Israeli public is still under trauma and shock after the 7th of October. We cannot move a society that I think is on a genocidal phase. We cannot move it to a liberal democratic phase at once. We have to move slowly, because that we know other examples from history. It has to be done slowly and carefully, and we first must stop what's going on in Gaza. Whether you call it massive war crimes, whether you call it crimes against humanity, whether you call it genocide, whether you call it whatever, at first it has to be stopped, because there are people that still needs salvation and rescue in Gaza, and Israel, and the hostages. So first stop that, and do whatever you can to stop the war machine from moving on, from continuing. And you have to do it by talking to the Israeli public and by getting more and more people to understand what's going on in Gaza, and talking to them in a way that they can compute. So this is for us the most important thing and most urgent thing to do right now, and the rest will have to wait for another time, but this is the most important thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asaf. Ernesto, please, the floor is yours.
Great, Asher. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this distinguished panel. And thanks for these really tremendous reports that were published recently in July. I'm going to take a few steps back and talk a little less concretely about what's happening in Gaza and think a little bit more about how to kind of contextualize some of the issues that we're looking at from a broader perspective. So I want to start off, obviously, with the question of genocide, which refers to the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. There's a number of different components and elements to it. And you can find really fantastic discussions about this and deliberations about it in the reports. And I'm sure the panelists would be happy also to answer any questions that people may have in the Q&A. But generally, what I want to emphasize here is that when we're thinking about genocide, we see that genocide normally occurs under the conjunction of a number of different factors, which is evident here. One is a long history of impunity, where a particular group has been targeted and suffered significantly of violence over a long period of time, and there's been no accountability or punishment for that. Two, where there's a long narrative of existential threat. So the civilian population on the other side is actually seen as a fundamental threat and not just the armed opponents of the so-called other side, but rather the entire population is treated that way. And then thirdly, when you have a crisis moment, particularly a security crisis, something involving armed violence. And we see all of these elements here with 2023. But needless to say, these are kind of proximate factors. There's longer histories to genocidal violence. But I emphasize this because this question about whether what's happening in Gaza is genocide or not, that is a discussion that's still happening today, really among scholars, among experts and human rights practitioners. Much of this was basically debated about a year and a half ago. I think the majority of scholars, especially outside of some areas of law, but the majority of scholars have seen this as genocidal violence in a pretty straightforward way for some period of time, or at least the debates happened about a year and a half ago in many respects. There are differences and discussions about the nature of intentionality and kind of the technical aspects of how one understands intent. But I want to emphasize a couple of points here as we take a step back. There's a version of this argument, which I think is very important, and it's about understanding the specific court cases of the ICJ and existing law and interpretation about how to understand intent. That's important, even though it is highly technical in many ways, separated from what's happening in the lived experiences of people who are actually suffering enormous harm and enormous violence. But then there's a version of this argument that I think is a bad faith argument, and this is what one sees very, very often in all of these types of cases. And what I mean by that is a tendency to basically portray a particular case, and this holds with Gaza as well, where it's either genocide or it's something else like counterinsurgency or war. So a common bad faith version of the argument is to say it's not genocide, it's actually just a counterinsurgency campaign, or it's a war, as if the two things are logically and practically exclusive of one another. They are not. Many wars and many counterinsurgency campaigns have genocidal phases to them. They are not logically different things. They do not exclude one another. So that's one important point. And essentially what we see here is basically a genocidal kind of counterinsurgency campaign. This has happened in many other cases. Guatemala in the early 80s is another example, but this is not uncommon. So I think there's a version of this that tries to insulate the state of Israel from these types of critiques by basically making a claim that is really not either logically or empirically defensible. The second point I wanted to emphasize about this is that there's often a tendency to focus very much on the question of genocide, but in international law, there is no hierarchy of crimes among genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. If you commit any of those are major fundamental violations of international law. So we can have discussions about whether this is genocide or not, and I believe it is. I think it's a pretty straightforward case of genocide. I've made the point for a long time. But regardless of where you fall on that, the point is that there are crimes against humanity and war crimes happening that have been happening for a long period of time. They're well documented. And so in this respect, this kind of question about, is it genocide? Is it not genocide? Again, I certainly think it is, but this really misses the bigger point, which is one of systematic, sustained, and really grievous and grave violations against civilian populations. The couple of last big points I wanted to make, and I'm watching the time here, so I'm kind of, consolidating all of this so we have plenty of time for discussion, is that we've seen a kind of an interesting shift. This has been going on since 9/11, but I think what's happening in Gaza captures it very well. which is the tendency of violent democracies. And here I mean the United States, Israel, France, the UK. So democracies that use violence. I'm using the term democracy here, somewhat loosely, but I think it captures these types of states. The tendency more and more to actually use the language of international humanitarian law to support the use of state violence, right? So it's different from what you see with extremely violent authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, which is basically regimes that largely discard or ignore the international law and the language of international humanitarian law, et cetera. What you see here is a very concerted effort to go through the motions of using that entire discourse, that language in a very kind of specific and technical way, but use it in a way that actually subverts the purpose of law and advances state violence and sovereign violence. So we're seeing that quite extensively in Gaza and in the West Bank. The United States has been doing this since 9/11 for a long period of time. The French and the British have done it as well. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's becoming more and more accentuated, I think. Lastly, I want to emphasize there's a few points here. There have been questions about, well, what can the UN do? What are the points of leverage? What are the cleavage points here from the so-called international community? I say so-called because it's not really much of a community as such, but in any case, it's something. I think this is actually a really dire moment. And what we're witnessing is the continued erosion and possibly collapse of the international atrocity prevention architecture. Gaza is not the sole example of this. This goes back farther. We can see other cases like Sudan and elsewhere, Myanmar, et cetera, that has also contributed to this. But we're seeing a really fundamental erosion in the capacity of law to actually bring constraints or parameters on the use of state violence. And we see this with the UN Security Council, which is largely useless when it comes to the prevention of atrocities. On atrocity questions, it's become largely useless. And this, by the way, is not something that only holds during the period of the Trump administration, the Biden administration as well, on Gaza, obviously. And we see, generally speaking, just an erosion of the possibility of multilateral action for bringing about peace building. So this is a very, very dire moment. It's difficult to see how to move beyond it, but one thing is for sure, the path is not through the UN Security Council. It's going to require the so-called small states and medium-sized states coming together and creating alliances to support peace-building work and support pressure. I think the UN Security Council is largely useless when it comes to this. So Gaza in many ways encapsulates many of the crises and catastrophes that we've been seeing unfolding within the global atrocity prevention architecture, and it amplifies it to a very, very large degree. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ernesto. I want to give you all an opportunity to respond to each other or to ask questions to each other before we open the floor for questions. Or
If I can come in on one point.
sure.
Ernesto, I wanted to address your point about, we're largely in an academic discussion debate about whether this is a war crime X or genocide. I mean, I'm exaggerating just for the sake of the argument here. And I can share here that I came from that camp personally when I joined Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and there was a question of whether to go into this investigation. By then, many scholars and some organizations already had come out with that conclusion. And I initially, my thought was, at this point, it doesn't matter organizationally for an organization to know what it puts out to the world, but in terms of what it does, I had the same question. And then I want to say two things about that. One, now I'm talking as a Jewish Israeli. I think it's very important to put that mirror before Jewish people and before the Israeli people. Genocide is not, it means to them something else. They make use of a previous genocide in a different way, in a very particular way. And so to put that mirror, if we think that that's what occurred, I think is something that we don't want to let, pass. I think it's important. And then the second point would be, again, speaking as a Jewish Israeli who has seen some responses. For example, my Palestinian colleagues in the organization, I just came from a staff meeting where there's so little that my colleagues can do for their people, except our joint effort here to stop something that hasn't been stopped right now. But the sense that we have given the right term to what is occurring, a sense of justice, to put it simply, was very important to them.
Yeah, I just, so if I could just respond to that very briefly. Thank you
Sure.
so much, Tirza. I think this is absolutely important, especially in the context of Israeli discourse, right? And Palestine-Israeli discourse. I think it's extremely important that human rights organizations from Israel speak about this in the language of genocide, because that's what it is. And it gives a particular kind of resonance and recognition that doesn't have the same type of impact if it comes from the outside. So in that respect, I think it's absolutely crucial. My point more generally is in the kind of the broader global discourse and debate, how this has gotten caught up in these discussions that draw a bit of attention away from the really kind of lived experience of suffering that Palestinians are going through. So that was really the emphasis point there. But I think in the context and the way you frame it, that's absolutely compelling. It makes absolute sense. And it's very needed because the change is not going to come from the outside.
I mean, it seems to me that there is a certain way that comes with the definition of genocide that cannot be, I think, compared with any other definition of what Israel is doing in Gaza. And it has internal purposes, clearly, which resonate with the point I was making in my own introductions about how difficult it is for Israelis to come to terms with that reality, or at least for the Israelis who are paying attention to what Israel is doing in Gaza. So the labeling here is of what is happening as genocide internally inside Israel is very, very important, because otherwise you could resort to explaining it in other measures that are easier to digest for the public, I think. Any other question to the panelists? I have one question about the question of the legal aspects of it. Clearly, I mean, one of the main differences between the two reports is the question of the legal definition of genocide. And I'm sure, Sarit, that you have read some critique of the B'Tselem report that supposedly overlooked that, and you addressed it in your remarks. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that, and then Ernesto, if you can insert your own thoughts about the question of the legality. Why is it so important? The legal language and the legal definition of a genocide.
Yeah. Maybe I could start with something we say in the report, which was actually authored with the assistance of Shmulik Lederman, who's a scholar of genocide. One of the paradoxes, the tragic, horrific paradoxes about genocides, is that in order for it to be recognized as a genocide, you have to have this legal pronouncement, which we know is a very high bar, and it's based on a legal process that in our case, for example, at the moment, looks like it's only going to be going ahead or coming to possible fruition in 2027, while the ultimate responsibility of us all is to just end the genocide as quickly as possible, right? This is just, so in order to get it to end, you have to recognize it, but the legal system is framed and it has been constructed quite rightly, possibly from a certain perspective, in a way that makes it almost impossible to get this genocide pronouncement in real time. Because clearly, the perpetrators of a genocide are not going to go ahead and, kind of like just say we're committing genocide. Although in the case of Israeli policymakers, their statements, coupled with what we've actually done on the ground, coupled with the horrific ramifications on not only on the mass killing of Palestinians, but on the mass starvation of Palestinians, the denial of any sort of humanitarian entry of electricity, water, the blanket accusation of all Gazans being Hamas supporters, a huge range of issues. You can show exactly that these people made statements, and these aren't just politicians, it's also military leaders that were then implemented. So it's quite amazing, actually, how Israel is then saying that, there is an alternative explanation. We said we were going to, starve them all. There were no innocents in Gaza, but actually then, in spite of the fact that our actions portray policies and demonstrate, and not just our actions and the results of the policies, but actually lots and lots of increasingly excellent reporting on the internal mechanisms. All of these are actually totally in line with the ultimate result, which is, as you described, tens of thousands of people killed and 2 million people right now being starved. Some have reached famine. And this is the problem when you're looking at it from the legal perspective. Now, as I said, B'Tselem did not intend to author a legal document. There's also another question now that we have to acknowledge, that the entire process, and I think Ernesto discussed it from the other perspective, it's beyond just the fact that genocide prevention is being compromised. There's quite a distinct possibility that all of these international structures will collapse with, the ICC and the ICJ, and any kind of accountability framework could collapse with Trump's sanctions, with United States reprisals against anyone who's holding Israeli policymakers and high-ranking military officials accountable. So this is all to explain that from our perspective, I think the human, the political with a small p, the societal, the historical evidence points to genocide. And we are very firm in our conviction that this is genocide. And it also entails very clear demands that we have to make of ourselves as Israelis, we have to make of our international colleagues and of the leaders of this world. And having acknowledged all of this, I think leads us to understand that we cannot now simply just wait until the competent legal authority makes the judgment. As I said in the beginning, it seems more and more likely, and more people are actually joining the camp that views this as extremely plausible. And remember also the court has also made, at least made or issued interim demands of Israel that rely on this plausibility argument. But again, I mean, if we wait now till 2027, then who's going to be left in Gaza to actually save? We have an obligation to speak out right now to save lives. And the shocking nature of this is that the people who are still alive today could be killed tomorrow and the following day. And like the fact that so many people have already been killed in Gaza and in Israel doesn't mean that there are many more people, many more human lives and futures and dreams to save. And this is what we're calling for. And this is why we've kind of taken a step back from the legal argument to the realm of the moral argument.
Thank you, Sarit. Ernesto, would you like to add anything?
Just a very small, brief point. I agree with everything Sarit said, especially the issue of time, right? And one of the challenges with genocide in international law is that essentially by the time you can actually show convincingly that it's genocide in a narrow legal sense, it's been going on for a while. I want to remind the audience that the name of the actual UN convention that defines what genocide is a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. The emphasis has always been on punishment, to the extent that there's been any emphasis at all. It's rarely been on prevention in any kind of systematic and institutionalized way. So there is that inherent tension, but this largely has to do with the fact that the convention as we see it today is a product of political negotiation and agreement between the victorious powers after World War II. It does not reflect what Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish-Polish jurist who defined the term, it does not reflect what he had in mind, which was more capacious. It would easily capture what's happening in Gaza. And then just on two other points that Sarit mentioned about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the ICC, International Criminal Court, which deals with individual responsibility, is very much on the ropes. It's very much under attack and it's being subverted. We'll see how it comes out of all of these attacks that are going on, but it's extremely weakened. I would not expect much coming out of it. The International Court of Justice is very slow and tends to be very conservative in its readings of intentionality. You can see that in the reports. It's possible that they'll read this as a case of genocide, but again, by then it'll be quite late. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. Could we make the argument that October 7th has not only ushered in the new Middle East, but it has also introduced to us a new challenge to the international system as we know it, and potentially a sign of its, I don't know, disintegration? Like the response of the international community, the inability to stop it, the complete impunity that Israel has been carrying out its actions. It's not only a reflection of a new Middle East, but it's a reflection of a new phase in international system that is being reshaped in front of our eyes. I'm just thinking out loud here. I want to go to a few questions. Go ahead, Sarit, please. There are a few questions that are coming from the audience. One is about, I guess, relates to academia, the Kroc Institute. Perhaps the Kroc Institute is a representative of the field of peace studies and academia broadly. And one person is asking about, what could we do except for, convening such panels such as this one? Is there anything that you can think we could do in a constructive way? Asaf earlier spoke about us as academics, intellectuals speaking about these issues, and I think this is a question that has been central for at least for the work of the institute for the past 2 years. Is there anything that we as an peace institute could be doing, except for these outreach work that we're currently engaged in?
I will just comment on this that we know that the political imagination of the right wing in Israel is very strong, is very violent, is very convincing, and they have the means to execute their imagination. And those means are leading us right now, as we said, to ethnic cleansing or genocide or something in between, or I will not go into this discussion. As I said, Shmulik Lederman is part of our team, and we accept his judgment. His part of the genocide research community. But I will say that in order to be able to be part of change, and first, as we said, to stop the war, but then to lead to something else, we need to have a political imagination that does not go back to what we already tried and failed, which is the old formula version of the two-state solution. Talking now about the two-state solution, as much as it important to at least stop the planned genocide, the planned ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and it is important in stopping that possibility, will lead us nowhere, because there is no place right now, there is no territory to build on a Palestinian state, not to mention Gaza, but also in the West Bank. So we're looking at a reality in which Jews and Palestinians will have to live next to each other, intermingled, intertwined, between the river and the sea for the foreseeable future. And the political imagination of the left wing in Israel, or any change-seeking activists and academics and politicians in Israel, needs to take this reality into account, that Jews and Palestinians will live as two nations, two peoples, between the river and the sea in the foreseeable future, with no segregation and no separation whatsoever. And I think that our political imagination should be a coexistence or coexistence, if you would like, but that's based on cooperation and partnership rather than separation.
Thank you, Asaf. I mean, you are part of the Land for All, am I correct?
Yeah, among other
formula.
things. And,
Yes.
and we also have the partnership based peace project led by intellectuals that are associated and affiliated with the Land for All. But we're also about to establish a center for co-national studies at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute with many other projects that deal, envision, and plan this future that should be part of our political imagination that's against the political imagination of the right wing.
May I ask you to share your work, perhaps following up on Asaf's conversation points for us? I mean, what you have shared with us before the panel about your work, about potential collaboration between different partners of yours, about a different future.
Yeah, about this comment of Asaf about the political imagination, the difference between countries that committed genocide, some won the war and some defeated. Germany was defeated, and then you can speak how to build a new Germany. This government, Netanyahu government, is not defeated. Israeli army is not defeated. The Israeli state is not defeated. So we are left with a criminal state. We are left the day after the ending of the war, we left with criminal state that its leaders are still free and in any moment might continue with its crime. So in this situation, when you live with criminal body that still have its criminal apparatus and criminal weapons and has nothing to do about the past in the meaning that what I did is wrong, meaning we don't have the reconciliation aspect. So you as Palestinian people live under country that's still criminal and in any moment, every moment is immediate dangerous moment, because in that moment, tomorrow, the genocide aspect could continue by other form like ethnic cleansing or killing individuals and or deport people. So this situation is very, very difficult to speak about vision, political imagination. The only thing that you have to do, how to neutralize this criminal state from its criminality. And the answer for me here, ending the incubation should be the major and the most important thing. If we want to think about anything, it's not now one state, it's not time of one region, it's end the incubation. Because the incubation is the continue of the incubation is the continue of the genocide by other means. And here we are dealing with right of lives. We are not under Germany that Hitler was killed. We are not under Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, that the leaders of the genocide bought under the ICTY, and some of them, they killed themselves. We are not even like Rwanda situation. We still like in 16th century that one group empire killed the other and continue to kill. When you have no mechanism to stop this killing. So this is why the political imagination should speak and about the political immediate threat. You cannot speak about future vision when you are speaking about political immediate threat. This is why I think the slogan should be now in the incubation. It doesn't mean that we have to put our visions like one land, one homeland for two people, one state or two states solution aside. But we are speaking now about the immediate solution. The immediate solution is ending the occupation. And I don't care whether 2 states, 3 states, 4 states, 5 states. In fact, as Asaf said, if Asaf has to be consistent, he said, I don't care whether you call it genocide, crimes against human. I want the genocide to stop. So if we follow this concept, we have the occupation to be ended, to start to have rehabilitation for Gaza and rehabilitation for West Bank and Jerusalem, because they are really bleeding there. This is what I think about the political demand of this emergency time.
Thank you, Hassan. We've had a few questions about the role of the United States, and I can just bring them all together. I mean, I think when you consider the United States first as complicit in the actions of what Israel is doing in Gaza and elsewhere on the one hand, but then as the body that is actually able to stop it. So two almost contradictory roles for the United States. On the one hand, as the one that is enabling it to happen, and on the other hand, as the body, as the government can put pressure on Netanyahu to stop it. I'm reminded, I think it was yesterday, that Trump said something about that he thinks the war will be over in 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know where that was coming from, and generally I don't believe a word of what he's saying, but I listened to him and I wanted to believe him. I wonder if you can just share your thoughts about the United States, both as a role of in being a complicit, but also as the body that is able to put an end to it soon.
I mean, I can maybe say
Sure.
a few words, just very briefly. First of all, I think maybe just to take a step back before Trump, I think the Biden administration's conduct is shameful, has to be historically and just simply morally exposed as having been complicit, because the argument on whether Israel was committing genocide 2 days or 2 weeks after Hamas's atrocities of October 7th, I think is an open question, and it's just, it can go on forever. What is absolutely clear is that that this could have been stopped a month into it, 2 months into it. We were told again and again this is going to end by by Christmas, as they used to say about World War I, and by the end of the year. And then now it's been ongoing for almost 2 years, and I think the people who were involved in Biden's administration, certainly President Biden himself, should also accept responsibility for their lack of action, their lack of willingness to hold Israeli perpetrators accountable. And things are coming out now in recent days. I mean, more and more reporting just indicating the depth of the cooperation and their collaboration with Israel's crimes. So this is the first point. And the second point is that, again, I mean, it is absolutely clear that Trump could now force Netanyahu to move into a hostage deal, release the hostages, and end the war. It's just simply impossible to understand what he really wants, whether he was, it's clear that the most recent hostage deal was the result of Trump's pressure. Netanyahu was left with no options other than to go ahead with that deal. But this is something that I think we need to see pressure in the United States, not just from the progressive democratic camp. Anyone, even supporters of Israel, supporters of the Israeli hostages, funnily enough, inside Israel, the hostage struggle is an opposition struggle, but in the United States, I think Israeli hostages often are viewed as a pro-Israeli, quote unquote, group. In any case, all of these people need to use all leverage they have vis-a-vis the Trump administration to try and get Trump to force Netanyahu to accept a deal. We're over a week now after Hamas's acceptance of the most recent conditions offered by the Qatar and Egypt, and the Israeli cabinet still hasn't even had a serious discussion of this. Israel still hasn't responded, we hear now from Qatar. So this is simply unconscionable. And this is also something that the Trump promised and Steve Witkoff promised families. And they are not, again, it's not for us to, it's clear that those people don't stand by their promises, but they made these promises to people who are not critics of the Trump administration. They're actually former hostages who visited Trump in the Oval Office and heard these things from him. So they have to make good on these promises.
Thank you very much, Sarit. We have to conclude here. I want to thank you all for participating, for sharing your thoughts, insights. Particular thanks for the organizations, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights, for issuing these reports. And I hope that soon we will be able to have a panel discussing rehabilitation, reconstruction in Gaza, and take it from there into a more constructive future than when we are now. Again, I'm really grateful for you all, and thank you for those who have listened to us. And I wish you a good day to all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.